Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Book Talk, where we are reflecting on race. Welcome to our Book Talk, where we are reflecting on race. I am Shante Charles. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we are having conversations on race, and I'm also live streaming through my YouTube channel, which is Church Love 333. So you can always check out these broadcasts there as well. And they are also archived there under my playlist, Reflections on Race. We are picking up our reading today with Tim White, White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son by Tim Wise. So that's who we are reading. And Tim Wise is a well-known host. He's a well-known anti-racism activist, and he has kind of been in this uh, field, rather, for several years now, several decades now, rather. And we are reading about his life and his reflections on race from the standpoint of someone who is considered a white American, as he calls himself, the white straight male in America, who is also has a Jewish, uh, how can I say it, a European Jewish background. So he's talking about his experiences of being a white man in America, what that means, what kind of privileges are afforded to him, what kind of inequities that he has noticed from the time he was a child up until his adult years and his further involvement in civil rights, in social justice, in the anti-apartheid movement happening in South Africa, and then what he's doing here across the United States. So if you see my lighting change, that's because I am using sunlight. So of course, my lighting is going to switch a little bit. But we are in the section of his writing called Louisiana. And now Tim does a lot of this particular book he's written. He talks a lot about the climate of what is happening in Louisiana, what's happening in New Orleans. So that is where we are picking up. We have just pretty much gone through his college years, and now we are reading about, excuse me, what happens as he is matriculating out of college and the political climate that is going on. I think this is going to be of interest to you as the reader today, as the listener today, because ironically, this same man that he helped to defeat in the past is running for office again, right? So he's going to do a lot of talking today about David Duke. And if you know anything about David Duke and just who he is, I mean, he was a former Klansman, high-ranking Klansman that decided to run for public office many years ago. And Tim Wise was part of those people who were instrumental in keeping him out of office, right? Well, here it is, decades later, and this same guy has been emboldened by the racial climate, the unhealthy racial climate that has been fostered by the things and by the rhetoric that has happened in this particular campaign cycle. And so now he feels emboldened to come back out of the woodworks. He should have stayed in somewhere, but he feels emboldened to come back out of the woodworks to run for office. And that should tell us something about the climate that has been created in our country, that someone who was seen as despicable decades ago, and rightly so, because of his ideologies, that this person has felt comfortable enough to return into the public square and run for office. That should disturb us. Unfortunately, it doesn't disturb people because we have made hate speech a normalized kind of speech in this country. So we're going to get right into the reading here. I've got to clear my throat. I am fighting off a cold, but I got to clear my throat, and then we will get right into the reading. By the way, I had the wonderful opportunity of going to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the new Smithsonian museum that opened up in DC. I went yesterday. I will be sharing possibly this weekend. I may take some time to just share my experience going there and what I learned. I'm also going to be writing a blog about it, just kind of giving a general review of my experience in the museum. Some highs, some lows, some unexpected things, some very good things. And so if you stick around this weekend, I'll come back on and I'll talk a little bit about what that experience was like. There is now, I believe, a 2-year waiting period for people to be able to get into the museum. And so I definitely want to share what I learned, what I got out of it, what I was able to view and participate in while I was there at the museum. But of course, I could not leave without going by the museum bookstore and grabbing a few awesome things, which I will share and show you on the broadcast that's available at the museum. And so I'll do that on the weekend and just kind of give you all a review of the museum itself. So I'm drinking out of my museum cup this morning. Amen. All right. So let's get started. White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son by Tim Wise. It was only during the waning days of our Shanty siege concerning the apartheid efforts in South Africa that I firmly decided to return to New Orleans in the fall. I had been thrown for a loop by the young woman at the divestment debate and her question and my miserable answer bouncing around in my brain for days afterward. Although I had toyed with the idea of moving out west after taking time off that summer to do what I wasn't sure, it was obvious that having done little to address racism in New Orleans, I had some work to do before I could move on. For several years, a group of about a dozen of us had been publishing an alternative paper called The Avant. And during the 2 weeks we'd been camped in front of the administration building, we'd begun to discuss creating a press collective so that those of us interested in continuing it could live together and work on its production. With 5 people initially in the house, which was already being rented beginning in August by one of the Avant principals, Don Morgan, rent would be cheap and we'd all be able to get by with monies generated from ad sales, hopefully, plus whatever odd jobs we might pick up. Having no better plan and feeling as though I needed to return to the city to work on issues related to racism, I cast my lot with the press co-op and took claim to one of the rooms in the large house on Robert Street. I spent the summer in Nashville at the old apartment, living on what little graduation money I had managed to get from my parents and grandparents. I also took the better part of a week in late June to travel to Kansas City and Louisville with Debbie, my girlfriend at the time, to see Grateful Dead concerts, which were a potpourri of white privilege, if ever the word had meaning. Needless to say, if Black concertgoers ever did as many drugs openly as Deadheads did, we need a lot more prisons to hold them all. But so long as you didn't do anything violent or disruptive, you could pretty well get as high as you liked at a Deadhead show, confident that nothing would happen to you. The trip was a fun diversion, but ultimately I was disenchanted with the largely apolitical and disconnected vibe of the whole Deadhead scene. Traveling the country selling tempeh and falafel in the parking lot of some stadium is not only not going to produce positive social change, it is terribly self-indulgent. The people who spent years of their lives following the dead around, the Grateful Dead around, though they might have thought they were doing something important and alternative by dropping out of the rat race, were really only substituting a new kind of conformity in which tie-dyes took the place of slacks or business suits, but ultimately participants were no more truly individual than anywhere else in America. In many ways, this had long been the problem with hippies. Most of them had always been more focused on living in countercultural ways rather than in organizing for social transformation. It had always been very ascetic, very self-referential, very much about doing your own thing, but not as often about liberation in the larger institutional sense. As for the Deadheads, it's one thing to like the music, but to turn vagabondism into a lifestyle while the world is burning is simply an exercise in privilege and social irresponsibility. Around mid-July, a few weeks before I was due to return to New Orleans, some disturbing news from Louisiana began to circulate, which called into even starker relief the difference between the real world and the world I'd left behind after the last Dead show in Louisville. According to polling data from around the state, ex-Klan and lifelong white supremacist David Duke was gaining ground in his campaign for the U.S. Senate. Having picked up a few points from the incumbent Democrat J. Bennett Johnston, because the conventional wisdom was that Duke flew below the radar. Since many who intended to vote for him might be hesitant to admit their plans to pollsters, even a poll showing him with 1/4 of the likely vote was disturbing. By now, he was pulling numbers close to a third. When Duke had announced he was running for the Senate, few had taken him seriously. Unfortunately, this is what has happened to what I like to call one side of the political wing. When people saw that Mr. Trump was getting ready to run for president, very few people took him seriously. And because very few people took him seriously, we have what we have today. Because very few people took him seriously. And the other piece that very few people took seriously is something I'm going to continue to say as a prophet of the Lord. And they are underestimating how many people in this country think like Donald Trump. I'm going to say that again. Put me on record. Okay. Many people in this country, especially the Republican Party, especially the conservatives, underestimated how many of their base, how many of their constituents, poor, middle class, or wealthy, which in our country, for some reason, if you make over $250,000, you're considered wealthy, when in actuality, those are your small business owners that keep our economy going. But that's a whole nother story. Many people in the Republican base underestimated how many people in this country think like Donald Trump. And that's why he is the Republican nominee. Yeah, that's why. Because he tapped into the thought process of many Americans who are considered the silent majority, not the moral majority, the silent majority. These are the people who think exactly like him, but don't say it in public. So he gave their silence a voice. But that's, again, a whole other scope. So here we are decades later, and we have the same gentleman running for office, David Duke, along with Donald Trump. When Duke had announced he was running for Senate, few had taken him seriously. Although he had won a state legislative seat the year before by 227 votes, most had seen that victory as a fluke, the result of a lackluster effort by media to expose his ongoing ties to extremists and his neo-Nazi philosophies. Frankly, even I hadn't fully appreciated the threat that Duke posed. Back during the legislative race in early 1989, I had gone to Duke's campaign headquarters with the woman I was dating at the time to check out his operation. Georgia called his office and asked if we could come pick up some campaign materials. She told them we were Tulane students and were interested in getting some information to counter the liberalism on campus. They were all too happy to oblige and said to come right away as they'd be closing up soon. David's office was in the basement of his house, so when we arrived, we walked into his home and saw the volunteers, all female and all blonde, except for one older woman who looked like someone's grandmother, answering phones, preparing mailers, and excited to see us. We don't get many inquiries from Jew Lane, one said, thinking herself quite clever for having voiced a common anti-Semitic slur on the university, seeing as how it included a large Jewish student population. As I looked around, trying to take in the scope of his operation, David burst through a curtain separating the main campaign office from what seemed like a smaller room, perhaps an alcove or a walk-in closet, to the right of where we stood. I hadn't expected him to be there. Indeed, I had hoped he wouldn't be, and was alarmed when he bounded toward us, hand extended, ever the campaigner. Though I had received some media attention from the anti-apartheid work the previous spring, most of it had been in the paper rather than on television, so I wasn't particularly worried about him recognizing me. Still, having to shake his hand, the hand of the nation's most prominent Nazi, so as not to blow my cover, was nauseating. As we prepared to leave, loaded up with campaign materials, I looked over to the bookshelf in the office and saw 5 or 6 copies of the book, The Hitler We Loved and Why, as well as copies of The Hoax of the 20th Century, which argues that the Holocaust of European Jewry never happened. The sightings confirmed everything I knew about Duke going into the headquarters, yet for reasons I still can't understand, I didn't go public with what I'd seen, which would have made for a great story and might have even derailed his legislative campaign. Later that year, when his Nazi book-selling operation would be exposed by Beth Rickey, a longtime Republican activist and committed Duke foe, I realized how stupid I'd been for not having gone public earlier. But at least the truth would eventually come out. Among those who took Duke seriously were Lance Hill and Larry Powell, the first of whom was a friend and a grad student at Tulane, and the latter of whom had been a history professor of mine. Lance had been on Duke's case since before the state house race and had compiled an impressive array of research on David's ongoing white supremacist activity, most notably his leadership at the time of an outfit known as the National Association for the Advancement of White People. So a lot of people wonder, where's the organizations for the advancement of white people? Well, David Duke is running one, former Klansman. National Association for the Advancement of White People, NAAWP. The group, which Duke had founded after leaving the Klan in 1980, fashioned itself the equivalent of the NAACP, but took all kinds of overtly racist positions, such as calling for eugenics programs to produce a master race of superior whites, advocating the creation of separate racial nations within the borders of the United States, and claiming that Jews were controlling the media so as to destroy the white race. Additionally, Duke sold merchandise from the back of the NAAWP News, including the books I'd seen on his office bookshelf, praising Adolf Hitler and suggesting that the Holocaust of European Jewry was a hoax. All throughout the spring semester of my senior year, Larry had asked if I might be interested in coming back to town and working for the newly formed Louisiana Coalition Against Racism and Nazism, the group that he, Lance, Beth Rickey, and a few others had formed as a pact, specifically to defeat Duke in the fall. Initially not planning to return to town and really not expecting Duke to do that well in the election, I had always passed. But now, sitting in my bedroom in Nashville, hearing the news about David's building momentum, I began to think that I'd made a terrible mistake, just like the one I made after seeing the inside of his campaign headquarters and not taking him seriously enough to have called the press. I got back to New Orleans in August, moving into the big yellow house at 1805 Robert Street, which, as I would later learn, was next door to the home to which Truman Capote had been brought from the hospital after his birth, and in which he had lived for a few years as a child. Truman's old abode was in far better shape than ours. The house in which we would live had been divided into two sides, each rented out separately, and in each in equal states of disrepair. It was simply put a hovel. Many years later, after Hurricane Katrina, I would go back to see how it had held up and could discern very little difference between its conditions after the flooding and that of 15 years before. Within a few months, the number of people living in the house would reach probably illegal levels, growing from 5 to 10, as several of us began moving in our significant others, or in another case, taking in 2 high school seniors from the school down the road whose parents didn't mind them living on their own. The only positive thing about this arrangement was how it kept our costs down. With rent coming to $525 a month and all of us broke, we were willing to make it work. $52.50 per person was pretty good, even in 1990. But as the people in the house changed, its mission as a press collective did too. We would only put out 2 more issues of the Avant before closing it down for good in March 1991. By the time we had moved in, it seemed as though we all had different ideas about what we wanted to do, and the paper wasn't high on anyone's list. Most of the roommates were still in school, and by then I was spending the bulk of my time at the Louisiana Coalition offices doing what I could in the anti-Duke campaign. The job that Larry had offered me before graduation was no longer available, it having been filled by Harry Osofsky, a Yale undergraduate who was home for the summer. Her task was to coordinate the anti-Duke network on Louisiana college campuses, in which places like New Orleans wasn't all that complicated. But in northern Louisiana, or at least in some of the smaller town schools, would prove daunting, giving Duke support in such communities. I'd known Harry for a few years, so when I started volunteering at the offices, we worked well together. I knew that the more I ingratiated myself to Lance and the harder I worked to assist the campaign, the better the chances were that once Harry returned to Yale, I would likely be picked as her replacement. I basically lived at the coalition headquarters, volunteering all day, every day. Within a few weeks before Harry had left, Lance brought me onto the paid staff to work with her, and then ultimately to take over once she went back to New Haven. My salary was $5.50 per hour, but Lance didn't put me on a fixed number of hours as such, since I was coming in early and staying late. Finding plenty to do, I was able to rack up 60 to 70 hours a week with no problem, which meant I was making over $300 a week, way more than I needed to live in the house. To be working in the campaign against Duke was exhilarating and occasionally scary. We would constantly have to monitor our mail, worried as we were that some of Duke's supporters might send something other than a love letter or a donation our way. As it turned out, we got plenty of angry diatribes, death threats, and envelopes filled with dead cockroaches and human feces. At least I think it was human. But thankfully, no bombs. Listening to the answering machine each morning was always entertaining. Who knew there were so many ways to call people the Jew bastard or the nigger lover. I had known of David Duke since I was 9. That was when I had first seen him on the Phil Donahue show, at which point he was still the Grand Wizard of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, the largest of the various Klan groups in the U.S. People had always commented on how attractive and how well-spoken he was, but in retrospect, back in his Klan days, the only reason people could have felt that way is because they were comparing him to the toothless, semi-illiterate folks who had been long the image of the typical Klansman. The bar had been set pretty low. Frankly, his high-pitched nasally whine and his slicked-down mop of hair, along with a squirrely mustache that looked like a ferret perched on his upper lip, had always made him appear as an underfed Adolf Hitler, which, come to think of it, is probably what he had been going for. By 1990, David had undergone numerous plastic surgeries to Aryanize his look, trading in the flattened down do and mustache for a neatly coiffed and lightly blonde head of hair, all the better to represent the interests of the white race. It was a white race, he insisted, that needed him to stand up for it, to repel the attack from reverse discrimination, busing in schools, parasitic welfare recipients, immigration, and any other evil under the sun unto which he could cast a brown face. Much of Duke's rhetoric was classic, right-wing, boilerplate, mirroring mainstream conservative discourse on such subjects as affirmative action, anti-poverty programs, and education, and sounding quite a bit like previous narratives spun by politicians like Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, and George Wallace for the previous 20 years. Because Duke steered clear of his more blatantly racist positions, those he'd advocated in the Klan or the NAAWP, for instance, like racial separation, he was able to convince some right from the beginning that he had truly changed. The Klan was in his past, he would insist, and after all, hadn't Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia, a Democrat, also been a Klansman in his youth? Of course, there were some differences between Byrd and Duke that the latter conveniently ignored. To begin, Byrd's youth had been 50 years prior, whereas Duke had only been out of the KKK for a decade. Additionally, Byrd had never joined another white supremacist group after leaving the Klan, while Duke had actually started another white supremacist group, one in the form of NAAWP, of which he would remain the head until a few days before the Senate election. More to the point, Byrd had apologized for his Klan membership and called it a mistake, while Duke had never repudiated the organization. In fact, Duke said he was proud of the work he had done in the Klan, and in 1985, just 2 years before he turned to electoral politics and began running for public office, admitted that his ideology had not fundamentally changed since his Klan days. Obviously, despite Duke's attempts to convince voters of his turn from racism, the only thing that had really changed about David was his face. Now, at some point, I want to come back and maybe through Periscope, I'm not sure yet. I may just do it through YouTube live stream. But at some point, I want to come back and I want to address why it is that America has yet, go research it, America has yet to declare the Ku Klux Klan as a terrorist organization. I want you to think about that. I want you to think about the fact that over 5,000 lynchings took place in the United States that no one, not a one, has been charged with the crime of lynching in the United States. I want you to think about the fact that this group has been around since the early conception of this country, terrorizing people. These people have been pictured in photographs. We have facial recognition software, so it's not like these people are unidentifiable. Their pictures are on postcards that have gone across the country while they are standing under lynched human beings. Their children gaze into the camera on some of these postcards. Again, we have facial recognition software, so it's not like these people cannot be identified years later. I want you to ask yourself, why? Why? With all of the terrorism that has taken place through the Ku Klux Klan, why has that group not been declared a terrorist organization? Why do most people not even consider what the Klan has done in the United States? Why do they not consider it domestic terrorism? Why are we even entertaining the idea of people who have been involved in an organization that is known for destruction of property, burning down churches, burning crosses in people's yards, hanging people from trees? Why would we even consider them as eligible for public office? Think about that. Let's continue reading. You might expect that organizing a campaign against a neo-Nazi would be easy, especially in the sense of settling on the proper strategy for doing so. You might think that since Nazis are pretty well reviled, pointing out Duke's ongoing affiliations with Hitlerian types would be an easy call and a winning plan about which all could agree. And if you did think that, you would be terribly wrong, as I would learn. Within the coalition ranks, there was an ongoing battle about how to respond to Duke and how to combat his candidacy. On one side were those of us who came from a more progressive tradition, and in this group, one could include Larry and Lance, and on the other were several of the board members from more conservative and Republican backgrounds who were nervous about challenging Duke on the matter of racism at all. As one would put it, we need racists to vote against Duke too. So presumably we shouldn't make a big deal out of the fact that he didn't like Black people much. Wow. They preferred that we talk about Duke having dodged the draft during Vietnam, or failing to pay taxes on time, or the fact that he once wrote a sex manual under a female pseudonym. For the most part, Lance, as director, was able to sidestep these unprincipled positions coming from board members, aided in that process by Beth Rickey, who, despite being a relatively conservative Republican, was motivated by an intense dislike for racism and a recognition that indeed that was the issue. Lance would placate the more conservative board members as best he could, but from his perspective, and all of us on staff agreed, the only ethically acceptable approach was to focus on Duke's ties to racial hatred and neo-Nazi extremism. We might need people who were far from enlightened to vote against Duke in order to beat him, but that didn't mean we had to ignore racism or pretend that draft dodging or late tax payments were equivalent to calling for the creation of a master race or separating people into their own sub-nations based on color. There were, of course, those who thought even this approach was too conservative. I had several friends, for instance, who believed we shouldn't call Duke a Nazi, not because he wasn't one, but because to do so was no better than for white right-wingers to call those of us on the left communists. It was, to their way of thinking, no better than red baiting. They preferred that we simply rebut Duke on the issues, explain why his claims about welfare recipients were wrong, why his stance on affirmative action was mistaken, why his perspective on immigration was flawed. One friend and colleague even said that the answer was to just go into the union halls and tell working class white guys that Black workers were their brothers and sisters, and they should recognize that all of them were being manipulated by the ruling class. Sure, just like that. Simple. Fact is, we did try to rebut Duke's policy narrative, but with a limited amount of time in which to mount an effective campaign, changing white folks' minds about subjects like affirmative action and welfare spending was pretty unlikely to work. Their views on these matters had taken many years to ossify and would take time to dislodge. Rather, we tried to remain focused on Duke's extremism or his connections to the assorted white supremacists, as well as his overtly racist ideology, spelled out in his own writings, and occasionally threw a bone to the conservatives who wanted to talk about taxes, the draft, and sex manuals by mentioning those as well. Because Louisiana's elections were open, meaning there were no party primaries, so all the candidates ran in a big pack, and the top two vote getters would face one another in a runoff. We were all nervous about the outcome. With the official Republican candidate, Ben Baggert, pulling 6 to 10% in the polls, the concern was that Duke might win the most votes in a three-way race, or at least get into a runoff with Johnston, where the outcome would be uncertain. Afraid of the same, Baggert dropped out in the waning days of the campaign. Having traveled the state in the weeks leading up to the election, I knew to be worried. I had organized students in Lafayette, Lake Charles, Alexandria, Monroe, Shreveport, and all places between, and I knew that Duke had a strong underbelly of support from scores of disaffected whites who were convinced that all their problems could be laid at the feet of Black people. Somebody tell me what's different. We're still laying all the problems of America at the feet of Black people, at the feet of immigrants, at the feet of Mexicans, at the feet of whoever. What's different? Same strategy, same campaign. Although Duke's personal obsession had always been Jews and the role of the Jewish community in undermining the white race, because the Jewish population of Louisiana was small, he rarely discussed the matter. But it wasn't because he hadn't wanted to. As one of his campaign managers would explain, they had had to beg him not to talk about Jews too much because it didn't resonate with people in Louisiana the way going after Blacks did. So he had stuck to the script and built his support base by doing so. Sadly, it wasn't just racist white folks or the desperate whites convinced by Duke's racial siren song to vote their resentments who posed a threat. There were also more than a few relatively liberal and even far left folks I knew and considered friends who genuinely mused about their desire to abstain from the election and not vote at all. To them, both candidates were unacceptable, and in keeping with their purity of arms leftism, they would refuse to vote for Johnston, the lesser of the two evils. That J. Bennett Johnston was indeed a conservative Democrat whose record on everything from foreign affairs to the environment was rightly offensive was inarguable. That anyone claiming to believe in justice could think a bad environmental record was morally equivalent to being a Nazi, however, suggested an intellectual and ethical miscalibration so profound as to boggle the mind. On election day, the coalition and our supporters gathered downtown at the Sheraton, which despite our fears, we fully anticipated would yet be the outcome. And although Duke did lose, the celebration quickly turned into something more closely resembling a funeral procession. Unmoved by the evidence of David's racism and his connections to the neo-Nazi movement, listen to this. A whopping 60% of white Louisianans had voted for David Duke. In some northern Louisiana parishes, and even next door to New Orleans, in St. Bernard Parish, the numbers climbed closer to 70%. Only, listen to this, only a high Black voter turnout had prevented this man from winning. But even then, his final tally of 43.5% of the overall vote sent shockwaves through the state and nation. As Lance explained that evening to the media, the election had been a referendum on hate, and hate had won. Listen, it's 2016. The question I want to ask America is hate winning? Will hate win this time around? Will people vote their resentments rather than what is good for the country? Because you see, I can fight policy. I can work with people in different parties, right, to come to a consensus about what is good for our country. But hate is something entirely different than a different policy stance or a different policy position. And that is what Tim Wise points out in today's reading. The fact that at that time in history, David Duke in the state of Louisiana was able to get over 40% of the overall vote. So though he lost the race, he proved that hate of other people had a stronghold on the state of Louisiana. And I look at what is happening in our country right now, and we've got to ask ourselves, what are people actually voting for? Clearly, they're not voting on morality, because if we were voting on morality, right, if we were voting purely by morality and our values, we wouldn't have the two main party candidates that we have right now, because both sides were offered something different. But our country chose something that is not related to morality on either side. So nobody can claim self-righteousness in this campaign. So one of the things Tim points out that I think is very important for him to point out is the fact that people were voting their resentments. They were voting based on, I'm sick and tired of X, Y, and Z. I'm sick and tired of these people, or those people, or you people. They were voting their resentments. They were looking for someone to blame rather than taking a look at their own selves, at their own lives, at the people that they had already put into office to lead, at whether or not the policies that were in place were actually the culprit of the reason of why their life was a certain way. So they were voting based on what they were sick and tired of, not necessarily voting for the person who would be the best person to hold public office to serve the needs of everyone. So I hope that even as we know across the country now, early voting has started. I hope that you will seriously consider whether or not you are voting because you understand the issues at play, or whether or not you are voting because you are voting based on the blame that you want to place on someone else, or that you are voting based on the resentment that you have for a group of people. Because at the end of the day, on November 9th, we're still going to be one nation. On November 9th, you're still going to have neighbors that don't look like you. On November 9th, you're still going to have immigrants in this country that don't look like you, that don't think like you, that don't talk like you, that don't believe like you. So November 9th, what will your attitude be? November 9th, what will your attitude be when your resentment does not yield you the results that you think you should have in this country? November 9th, what is going to be your attitude towards your neighbor? November 9th, are you still going to be able to go into your job and do your job and live amongst those who don't look like you, think like you, speak like you, talk like you, believe like you? Or is it going to be a very fatalistic view that, oh, the country's going up in smoke? Because we said that 4 years ago. And a matter of fact, we said that 8 years ago. And a matter of fact, before that, we said it 12 years ago. But guess what? The country's still here. So I hope that you got something out of today's reading. White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son by Tim Wise. And we're going to be back on Monday to continue our reading. As I said again, I may come back on this weekend to talk about my experience with the museum and show you guys some more things that I picked up from the museum. I hope that you have a great and wonderful day. It is, as I call it, 5-Word Friday. It is Get Free Friday. So I hope that you are taking the time to really free your mind, release your mind from negativity as you go into this weekend. Really think about your future, think about your life, and make some wise decisions over this weekend. I hope that you and your family will be strengthened. I hope that you and your family will be blessed. And I hope that you and your family would make decisions that benefit not just you, but this entire country. This is our book talk for today and our reflections on race. Have a great weekend. Take care and God bless. Again, thank you for viewing by YouTube live stream. I hope that you have a great and wonderful day. Take care and God bless.